any portion of the church have really broken faith with them. Now that was an observation that was made in 1894 by people in Australia, and we must remember that the lines of communication were not like they are 100 years later. But there were people in those days, even in Australia far away from Scotland, who were taking notice of what was happening in this part of the world. By 1900, the Reverend Walter Scott and Mrs. Scott paid a 6-month visit to Scotland. That was the year that Dr. Rainey skillfully engineered a union between the Free Church and the United Presbyterian Church. But Mr. Scott knew on what side of the fence he was, and at the half-yearly meeting of the Synod of November 1900, Mr. Scott, as a delegate of the reconstituted Synod of the Presbyterian Church of Eastern Australia, was asked to address the Synod. At the same Synod, discussion was held regarding the relationship between the Free Presbyterian Church and the minority Free Church. The Synod urged its congregations to stand fast to the testimony raised in 1893. Mr. Scott was amongst these. The links with Australia became one step closer. It was another 9 years before Mr. Scott was in Scotland again. At the November Synod of 1909, he was associated with it and addressed it, showing how he was isolated from the larger Presbyterian churches, just as the Free Presbyterian Church was in Scotland. His own congregation had been cut asunder by the Expulsion Act, so they were now 600 miles by sea and land from the nearest Presbyterian fellowship. But, and this is significant, what Mr. Scott had to say, but even they were mingling with the surrounding churches and quietly learning their ways. It was not surprising that at the half-yearly meeting of the Synod of 1910, that Mr. Scott made his application for admission to the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Since the whole matter of Mr. Scott's admission had been discussed in a private committee, the Synod, after some further deliberation, believing him to be a true minister of the gospel, agreed to receive him on condition he accepted the constitution of the Free Presbyterian Church, set forth in the subordinate standards, etc. Here was the first direct link with Australia. This was strengthened a year later when Mr. Scott's congregation in Brushgrove, Grafton, petitioned the Synod to be identified with the Free Presbyterian Church and asked for a deputy to be sent. Mr. Scott never returned to Australia but spent the rest of his ministry in Chesley, Canada. This petition was signed by 3 elders and 10 communicants and a few adherents. This was received sympathetically. Mr. Cameron said to the Synod, and I quote, that he was sure that they all felt the deepest sympathy with their friends in Australia. The greatest difficulty in these early days was to provide them with ministerial supply. Though a deputy could not immediately be promised, they were nevertheless to be encouraged by receiving the office bearers, members and adherents into the fellowship of the church. That's the end of that quote from Mr. Cameron. Despite the smallness of the cause, as much help as possible was given. These events indicate that since 1893, our church was characterized by its faithful evangelical outreach consistent with Matthew chapter 28. This was demonstrated firstly when Mr. Adasi was received to be trained as a missionary for Africa, and later when Mr. Scott and the Brushgrove Grafton congregation were received. New Zealand was also later to experience a similar interest when deputies were sent to encourage the isolated families near Gisborne and the King Country in the centre of the North Island. With regard to Australia, the Church in Scotland sought to meet its responsibilities as soon as possible. By March 1914, the Reverend Duncan Mackenzie set sail to supply the Australian people as the first deputy. In his report, he writes, and I quote, "One feels very strongly for this congregation, so far from the home country, without a stated ministry for more than 6 years, struggling to maintain the whole counsel of God. One feels for them all the more, confronted as they are with much opposition. They have been deprived of their 2 churches and a manse." The remembrance of his visit provoked much sympathy. He writes, and I quote, "I felt at home among the people. I am struck with the earnestness and pathos with which the office-bearers pleaded in prayer for the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland and for the continuance of the gospel preached among them. I shall always have very pleasant recollections of the people, and I pray the Most High to remember them in mercy, in enlarging their borders, and in providing them with an ambassador commissioned from heaven, endued with power from on high, who shall declare all the counsel of God to them." End of quote. These were the strong bonds the deputies over the years forged with our Australian brethren. Our people in Australia and Scotland were of one mind, striving for the same faith of the gospel. This was the common bond which overcame the barriers of national identity and different cultures. Our Australian people were conscious of the privilege and indebtedness of belonging to a true church, with its Reformation principles still observed in doctrine, worship, and practice. Only when these bonds are slackened will the barriers of culture and nationalism become an obstacle and hindrance to the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Despite the help given by Scotland, the little congregation on the Clarence River of northern New South Wales declined to the extent that by the 1930s, public worship was no longer held. It was the Reverend McQueen London who came as a deputy in 1936 that revived public worship, which has continued to this day. Mr. McQueen continued his work to encourage Free Presbyterians who lived in New Zealand by continuing across the Tasman. By the beginning of the Second World War, when the Reverend Beaton visited Grafton, the new church building was opened by him. And one of the old members of the congregation, when I arrived there in 1976, now deceased, quaintly remarked to me that the church was built on 2 shilling bits. That is, by the small contributions gathered over time. And at the opening of the church, one visiting minister from another denomination remarked to another minister visiting from another denomination, said that when old Mrs. Scott and her sister passed away, it would soon come to an end. On hearing this remark, Mr. McGregor, that's Mary Shaw's father, Mary Shaw is still living in Sydney, responded by saying, "You're a false prophet, MacLeod." Again,